History class, a place filled with heroes and villains, grand victories, and tragic defeats. Or is it? The truth is that the stories we learn in school are often carefully curated. Victors tend to write history books, and sometimes their hands are dripping in blood. Today, I'm going to unearth 25 of history's dark skeletons. And when I say dark, I mean dark. From massacres and genocides to forced sterilizations and human vivisection, today's list is not for the faint of heart. I'm Mike with List 25, and here are 25 dark historical secrets kept out of the classroom. 25. The Great Leap Forward Famine. China's Great Leap Forward, envisioned as China's glorious leap into industrial dominance, ultimately descended into a horrifying period marked by cannibalism. Unrealistic quotas and a shift away from traditional farming practices choked the life out of food production. As famine gripped the nation, the social fabric began to unravel. Thousands of cases of cannibalism were documented. Accounts emerged of parents trading their children, neighbors disappearing, and families resorting to unspeakable acts for survival. The desperation was so profound that documented cases even revealed cannibalistic markets where human meat was bartered and sold like any other product. 24. The Holodomor. The Holodomor, which translates to death by hunger, wasn't just a famine. It was a deliberate act of cruelty used to crush Ukrainian nationalism and resistance. This horrific event, which took place in the early 30s under Joseph Stalin's rule, saw millions perish in Soviet Ukraine. Back then, Ukrainians weren't simply suffering a lack of food. They were victims of policies specifically designed to starve them. Grain stores were seized, crops burned, and borders sealed. Between 3 and 7 million Ukrainians died. It's a stark reminder that the war between Russia and Ukraine isn't exactly a new one. It has roots that date back decades. 23. The Rwandan Patriotic Front's role in the Rwandan Genocide. There's a saying that goes, "In Africa, the man with the gun is king." It's never rung more true than during the Rwandan Genocide of 1994. While the Hutu extremist government and militia forces were responsible for the slaughter of over 800,000 Tutsis, a darker truth exists. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by current Rwandan President Paul Kagame, also bears responsibility for atrocities committed during the conflict. Human Rights Watch documented multiple instances of executions of Hutu civilians by RPF soldiers after the fighting had ended and government forces were gone, with some of the massacres even targeting refugees. It raises troubling questions about the RPF's motives and casts a terrible shadow over their ultimate victory. 22. Winston Churchill and the Bengal Famine. Winston Churchill was one of Europe's most formidable leaders. His input led to a roaring defiance against Nazi Germany, leading Britain through World War II. The man was a titan and prime minister for 12 years. But here's the thing. History isn't always black and white. Churchill also played a part in the horrific Bengal famine of 1943. Millions in India starved to death, caught between the Japanese threat and some questionable decisions by the British government. Churchill even permitted rice exports from India despite the crisis, prioritizing food for Britain over sending aid to starving Bengalis. 21. The British Empire's use of concentration camps during the Second Boer War. At its peak in 1920, the British Empire covered an estimated 35.5 million square kilometers. That's 13.7 million square miles. This constitutes roughly 1/4 of the Earth's total land area. However, how they acquired this extensive territory is rarely discussed. One such instance is the Second Boer War, fought between the British Empire and the two Boer republics in South Africa. The highly effective guerrilla tactics of the Boer commandos frustrated the British for over 2 years. In a desperate attempt to break Boer's resistance, the British High Command resorted to a brutal tactic, targeting women and children. Over 100,000 women and children were forcibly relocated into concentration camps, and scorched earth policies were implemented. 26,000 died. Faced with this brutality and the desire to reunite their families, most Boer commanders eventually accepted British terms of surrender in May 1902. South America remained a British colony until 1961. 20. The indentured Irish children. How familiar are you with the concept of indentured servitude? Well, it's a form of labor in which a person is contracted to work without salary for a specific number of years. In earlier times, many migrants made their way to the New World through indentured servitude. However, a lesser-known, darker chapter involves the forced indentured servitude of Irish children during famines. The children, orphaned or victims of kidnapping, weren't offered a new life, but rather sold into slavery, albeit under a different name. Since they were considered cheap labor, they faced years of backbreaking work to repay their passage. 19. The Red Summer of 1919. Following World War I, black veterans returned home expecting a different America, one where they'd be treated as equals after fighting for their country. However, fears of an uprising fueled by wartime experiences and growing activism fueled anxieties among white communities. Racial tensions exploded in Washington, D.C. in July of 1919, with white mobs attacking African American citizens. This violence quickly spread to other cities too, like Chicago, Tulsa, and Elaine, Arkansas. The Red Summer was a nightmare for black communities. Over 200 people were killed in Elaine alone, with an estimated total of 64 lynchings and hundreds more deaths nationwide. 18. The Massacre of Polish Officers at Katyn. Not all wartime secrets are hidden in bunkers. The Katyn forest held one of the darkest, the mass graves of over 22,000 Polish POWs, officers, police, and intellectuals, executed by the Soviet NKVD in 1940. But instead of coming clean after the war, the horrific act was then buried beneath a lie. The Soviets decided to blame Nazi Germany. The secret stayed in place until the late 80s and left a permanent stain on Soviet history. 17. The Stolen Generations. As we've already seen today, the history of colonization is riddled with dark chapters. But it was especially heinous when children were involved. In both Australia and the US, government policies from the mid-1800s to the 1970s tore Indigenous children from their families. Forced into residential schools designed to erase their cultures, these children suffered horrific abuses, both physical and sexual, with many never returning home. The true scale of their horror will never come to light, and we're left with the sanitized versions of history overshadowing the lasting trauma that continues to affect Indigenous communities to this day. 16. Leopold II's reign of terror in the Congo Free State. While the brutality of King Leopold II's rule in the Congo Free State is a historical footnote, the true depths of depravity are rarely discussed. Imagine a system where failure to meet quotas resulted in severed hands and feet. Those who dared resist faced public executions, their bodies left to rot in the open as a constant reminder of Leopold's absolute power. Villages deemed unproductive were burned to the ground, while those forced into labor in disease-infested swamps died a slow and agonizing death. The social fabric unraveled completely, with starvation and violence leading to unthinkable acts of desperation. The human cost? Estimates suggest half of the Congolese population, millions of men, women, and children, died from disease, starvation, violence, and exhaustion. 15. The comfort women of World War II. World War II wasn't just fought on battlefields. The Japanese military established a horrific system of sexual slavery, euphemistically called comfort stations. Tens of thousands of women, primarily Korean, but also from China, Southeast Asia, and the Dutch East Indies, were forced into prostitution to serve Japanese soldiers. Here they faced violence, disease, and unimaginable suffering, with many not surviving the ordeal. 14. The Herero and Namaqua Genocide. Can you imagine being hunted down, not for sport, but for your very existence? This was the horrifying reality for Namibia's Herero and Namaqua people between 1904 and 1908. German colonial forces, fueled by a mix of racial prejudice and greed, launched a brutal war of extermination. The Herero, initially fierce resistors, were ultimately driven from their water sources and herded into the unforgiving Namib Desert. An estimated 80,000 Herero, roughly 80% of their population, died from dehydration, starvation, and exposure, while an estimated 50% of the Namaqua population was killed during this horrific period. 13. The Guatemala STD Experiments. The Tuskegee syphilis study is a notorious example of racial injustice in medical research. But the US's dabbling in unethical medical experimentation goes far beyond Tuskegee. Have you ever heard of the Guatemalan STD experiments? US government researchers deliberately infected Guatemalan prisoners and sex workers, some of them pregnant, with sexually transmitted diseases without their informed consent. These experiments were meant to study the progression of these illnesses, but it came at a horrific cost. Pregnant women faced untreated infections, risking their own health and passing these diseases onto their unborn children, leading to devastating consequences. 12. The forced sterilization of women of color in Puerto Rico. If you had been hoping that I was done with unethical medical studies, well, then I have some bad news for you. The worst is yet to come. From the 1930s to the 1970s, the US government, in collaboration with Puerto Rican officials and medical professionals, orchestrated a systematic campaign of forced sterilization targeting women of color. Presented as a solution to poverty, these procedures were performed on a staggering scale. In fact, by 1936, a third of all Puerto Rican women had been sterilized, often through coercion, misinformation, or outright lies about the permanence of the procedure. 11. The exploitation of native Hawaiians by American colonizers. Hawaii's postcard perfect image, idyllic beaches, turquoise water stretching to the horizon, and opulent estates, masks a complex history. In 1893, American businessmen, led by Sanford B. Dole, orchestrated a coup d'etat against Queen Liliuokalani with backing from the US military. It had devastating consequences for the native population. Native Hawaiians were stripped of their ancestral lands and forced to work under harsh conditions on foreign-owned sugar plantations. The Hawaiian language, religion, and cultural practices were actively suppressed. Generations of Hawaiians faced poverty and displacement in their homeland. Today, disputes over land ownership and cultural identity remain unsolved. 10. The Rape of Nanjing. Can you imagine the horror of being in a city under siege? In late 1937, Nanjing, China, fell to Japanese forces. Promises of safety for the civilians vanished as the city turned into a battlefield of unimaginable brutality. Mass executions claimed the lives of an estimated 100 to 300,000 people, and women and girls of all ages faced a horrifying fate: systematic wartime rape. The Rape of Nanjing, as this terrible event has become known, sent shockwaves through the international community and continues to shape relations between China and Japan to this day. 9. Unit 731's human vivisection. While many are aware of Unit 731's inhumane biological warfare experiments, the full extent of their atrocities will remain out of classrooms for the foreseeable future. Among the other horrors, the unit also routinely practiced vivisection, the dissection of living bodies, often without anesthesia. Prisoners were subjected to amputations to study blood loss, the surgical removal of organs to examine the effects of disease, and exposure to freezing temperatures to research frostbite treatments, to name but a few. Unit 731 was the embodiment of unimaginable cruelty and disregard for human life. 8. The Vatican's complicity in Nazi war crimes. The Vatican, home to the Pope, stands as a beacon of hope, peace, and forgiveness for billions of Christians worldwide, which is why this entry is probably going to make a lot of them feel uncomfortable. Historical records show that after World War II, when the world was reeling from the atrocities of the Nazis, the Vatican was involved in aiding Nazi war criminals. Estimates suggest hundreds, possibly even thousands of Nazis received sanctuary, escape routes out of Europe, and even new identities from the Vatican. 7. The French nuclear testing in the Pacific. Between 1966 and 1996, France detonated over 200 nuclear weapons in French Polynesia, a stunning archipelago in the South Pacific. Now, unlike the widely condemned US and Soviet tests, France's nuclear program unfolded under a veil of secrecy, which made it more difficult for the international community to monitor and condemn their actions. Indigenous populations faced devastating consequences. Radioactive fallout contaminated their lands and bodies, leading to a surge in health problems like thyroid cancer, leukemia, and birth defects. 6. The Massacre of Native Americans at Wounded Knee. Some pieces of history are often left out of classrooms, and we rarely learn about the experiences and sufferings of marginalized groups. The exact circumstances that triggered the shooting at Wounded Knee remain the subject of debate. However, heightened tensions, a possible misunderstanding over weapons surrender, and ultimately a lack of restraint by US troops all contributed to the horrific massacre where 150 to 300 Lakota died. In the aftermath, the US government offered minimal compensation and relocated the Lakota people further onto reservations where most of them remain today. 5. The forced removal of Japanese Americans during World War II. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor is etched in American memory, but in the aftermath of the tragedy, another far less known piece of history unfolded. The forced relocation of over 100,000 Japanese Americans, many of them US citizens, into internment camps. Families were torn apart, and their civil liberties and property rights were unjustly stripped away. Homes and businesses were abandoned or seized, causing immense financial hardship. These Americans were forced to live in harsh conditions for years, and it wasn't until 1946 that most were finally allowed to return home, often to find their lives and communities shattered. 4. The White Australia Policy. Racism is one thing, but racism hidden behind language tests is something else entirely. Throughout the 20th century, Australia's immigration policy prioritized European-descended immigrants. Known as the White Australia Policy, one essential tool to achieve this goal was a dictation test introduced in 1901. While seemingly a language proficiency assessment, the test was administered in such a way that it made it nearly impossible for non-Europeans to pass and effectively blocked immigration from Asia and other non-European regions. The policy was finally systematically dismantled between 1950 and 1970. 3. The selling of corpses in 19th century London. When we bury our loved ones, we trust they'll remain undisturbed. Still, in 19th century London, a macabre trade fueled by the medical field's demand for cadavers shattered this trust. Grave robbers routinely desecrated graves, demonstrating that no corpse, not even those of babies, was truly safe. The desperation for corpses was so intense that some, like the infamous duo Burke and Hare, resorted to murder. The worst part is that these crimes went largely unpunished, as the very institutions meant to uphold the law turned a blind eye to the grim origins of their dissection subjects. The body snatching trade didn't stop until the Anatomy Act of 1832 passed, meaning that graves were desecrated for more than 100 years. And yet, the true extent of these crimes remains shrouded in history. 2. The Great Igbo Landing. Though often overshadowed by other slave rebellions, a deeply impactful act of resistance occurred in 1803. A group of Igbo people, newly captured from what is now Nigeria, were being transported aboard a slave ship destined for Georgia. They seized control of the ship and forced it ashore off the coast of St. Simon's Island. And here is where the story turns tragic. Rather than submit to a life of enslavement, many of the Igbo people chose to drown themselves in the nearby Dunbar Creek. Historians believed up to 75 people drowned. And yet, despite their defiance and sacrifice, the events at Igbo Landing have largely faded from common historical narratives. 1. The Manhattan Project's human experimentation. Did you stand in line for the movie Oppenheimer? Hollywood glorification aside, the Manhattan Project is often remembered for one thing and one thing only: the atomic bomb. But there was so much more going on behind the scenes. One of the biggest secrets was the experiments on unwitting human beings. The test subjects, from soldiers to prisoners and the terminally ill, were injected with plutonium, uranium, and other radioactive substances. Scientists also exposed people to dangerous levels of radiation to study its effects on the human body. These medical experiments exploited the vulnerable with callous disregard and stand as a testament to the ongoing human cost of unchecked ambition. So, what other historical events were too dark for school? Let me know in the comments below. Also, don't forget to share, like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and check out our social medias, including my personal ones, links in that description below. And if you, I guess, enjoyed, hopefully didn't enjoy, I don't know, but check out this one. 25 obscure World War II facts that'll surprise you. It's crazy. It's a roller coaster ride from wacky inventions, it's like bat bombs, to incredible acts of courage. So to go there, just click right here. This was a dark list. I warned you earlier. Humans, we suck. We're really bad. Come on, we can do better. We can. I believe in us. Man.